Thank you, Peter. Yes, Seventh-day Adventists have been loyal, faithful participants in our Faith Communities Today project for since the beginning, and so I have fond memories of Roger Dudley and Monty Salon, and it's the person who is sort of taking care of our farm up in New Hampshire as we transition up there, is a longtime Seventh-day Adventist as well, and I think his children all came to this school. He was excited to hear that I was going to be down here, and so I have many connections with Seventh-day Adventists. I want to I want to share with you from two different research projects that have been occupying us over the last number of years. We're engaged not only in the Faith Communities Today project, which has started in 2000, but also a project over the last 5 years called Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations. We refer to it as EPIC, because I wanted to leave my job having done some EPIC research. Essentially what we've been doing is tracking how congregations have been reshaped because of the pandemic. So I'll talk specifically about a survey that we did at the end of 2025. It's our most recent look at the data 5 years after the pandemic, and then also a survey we did of 25,000 people who attend congregations in 2024, and looking at both of those data sets a little bit. You're all welcome to these slides if you want them. I also have brought copies of the reports from both of those studies, and I have plenty, so you're welcome to have one. Started. I'm not doing this alone by any means. My team has changed over the years, but currently there are 7 of us doing various things, a lot of postdoctoral fellows, and we've been trying to actually cultivate in social sciences more young folks who are interested in the study of congregational life. That doesn't happen very often. If those of you who have attended AHSRA, RRA, ASR, oftentimes congregations are an afterthought. It's how people believe it. But in fact, it doesn't really matter what people believe if there are no institutional supports for those beliefs. And so it is a commitment of mine that congregations are kind of the bedrock of American religious life. And so we're trying to convince some young researchers of that as well. So it clearly is a collaborative project. As I said, this really draws on 2 different traditions. Our Faith Communities Today project, which is a collaborative venture of many different denominations and researchers, and then this Lilly Endowment funded EPIC research project. It turned out that in 2020, right before the pandemic lockdown and everything, we had already fielded our survey for Faith Communities Today. So most of the data collected in 2020, about 12,000 responses out of the 15,000 or so we got, came before the pandemic. So we had this lovely baseline of what congregations looked like right before that happened. That went a long way to convince the endowment that we were the perfect place to sort of track how things fell out. And we weren't so interested in the initial period, because that was chaos, and everybody jumped in to try to see what congregations were doing immediately. What we were more interested in is what were the long-term repercussions of this traumatic event. And you can see we've amazingly, Lily gave us enough money to really continually go back and just track year by year different dimensions of how the congregations were shifting. Again, I have to say, it's a fantastic way to end my career, to have all the money I possibly could use, and a traumatic event to sort of watch. I mean, so, thank God for the pandemic. The snapshot of congregational life at this point, not really presentation for the public of sorts, but basically what we found in 2025 was a really fairly optimistic picture of congregational life that we hadn't seen prior to that. The median in-person attendance was 70. The median income was around 200,000. About a third of folks were over the age of 65. Around 60% were female. 88% of clergy were male. Some changes to that overall picture, but when we started to look at the various dynamics that were playing out in congregations, there was as I'll talk about a little bit more, there was a real shift between 2023 and 2025. The data up through 2023 were somewhat discouraging. And what we saw in our 2025 results was that attendance had increased, financial giving was continuing to grow. There was more activity in terms of evangelism, a lot more emphasis on willingness to change. Volunteering had gone back up. It was almost like congregations were still dealing with the trauma of the pandemic, and then they had turned a corner with this last survey that we did, which actually quite surprised me. I didn't believe it, actually, partly because the data, if you start to look at it across time, what I had been living with the Faith Communities Today project was every time we surveyed congregations, the median in-person worship attendance continued to drop. So the first time we did in 2000, the median attendance was 137 in worship. And by 2020, it had dropped to 65. So it was cut in half. And then the pandemic happened and things sort of fell off a cliff and started to come back up. But I fully expected and actually gave many talks saying that when the 2025 data came out, I fully expected the median to be about 55, which would have kind of followed the trajectory that they were on. And instead, we found it was 70. And that's the first time in any of my research in my career that we've actually seen an increase in attendance. And that's not including online participants. If you include, don't usually do, but if you include those, the median is 75. I frankly did not believe, I thought we had got it wrong. And I don't know if you follow other research, but there was some research out of Great Britain that said young men were flocking to the church and they had all this data. And then it turned out to be a mistake in calculation and so they had to retract all that. That had happened about 9 months ago. And I was worried that was happening here. So we went back, we reweighted, we looked at how we cleaned the data. We did all kinds of things to make this go away because I didn't believe it. But in fact, it's true. Probably not a revival by any means, but we'll see what happens. But the fact that this is the first time, it didn't just rebound to where it was, but it actually has gone up, is a very, very interesting thing to me. That's not the only good news. Ever since, in fact, since the pandemic, congregations have had more money. They may not, the clergy may not talk about that, but their income is actually above what they would need to keep pace with inflation. So this is a real increase in, and you can see that for 2025, the median is over 200,000 for a congregation, which is far above where it would be if it was keeping pace. Now that's also true for expenses. Insurance has really gone up significantly for many congregations and other things, but there's still more congregations are being sustained with a surplus of income. And we attribute this almost entirely to online giving. A decade or more ago, I played around with this data, and it was absolutely clear that if you had online giving, you were going to get more per capita from your people. If you emphasize online giving, you were going to get even more per capita. And so I preach to my doctor of ministry students all the time, and others, do this, implement this technology. And they didn't, but the pandemic forced so many congregations to do that I would have predicted this. There's a reason why NPR says become a sustaining member and give it monthly because you get more money. And that's especially true if your people aren't coming as often, but their money is still being deposited. So income has gone up. One of the other major things that we look at in our surveys to determine how vital a congregation is, and this is in natural church development too, is how willing a congregation is to adapt, to change, to modify what they're doing. And so we always look at that question immediately. What percent strongly agree with this statement that they're willing to change? And it was not good throughout much of the faith communities today. You can see it has continued to drop down over time. But then the pandemic came, and in 2021, when we did our first survey post-pandemic, it was almost 40% of congregations said they were strongly agreeing that they were willing to change. Not surprising, so many of them were. But and I was really optimistic that this is going to force congregations to make the changes that they needed to make. But then we saw in the subsequent surveys the rubber band stretching back, right? People closing in on themselves, to the point that in 2023 with our survey, it was down to just about as low as it had gotten pre-pandemic. And so I was back to being depressed again, which was where I usually am. But 2025, again, just really surprised me. We saw this significant rebound to the point where almost a third of congregations now strongly agree with that statement. It does have, I think, a really surprising effect on some of these things. We've also seen the rise again in the rate of volunteering. Normally, a clergy person was estimating about 40% of their people volunteer regularly, and that had dropped during the pandemic, but it's now back to where it was pre-pandemic level. The other thing that has rebounded is how much a congregation thinks they have a future, and you can see the yellow and green bars getting essentially a little bit larger over time. In 2025, almost 70% said that they're doing okay and that's going to continue, or they're thriving and that's going to continue. And so there has been a shift not only in things like attendance and giving, but also in attitudes about changing and the outlook for the congregations themselves. So it looks like things are going well, but in fact, as you all know, no recovery is uniform across all congregations. It's absolutely clear that the larger the congregation is, the faster it's recovered, and it's more strongly recovering than smaller congregations. Smaller congregations remain kind of financially and then also numerically challenged a good bit. Religious traditions also have a pretty significant effect. More congregations from evangelical traditions are doing better than mainline Catholic or Orthodox, and also than non-Christian congregations. But some of that, I think, has to do with the changes in immigration policies and stuff. But and then geographically, Southern and Mountain West have recovered significantly more than the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. And this is in a context of, as I said, some pretty significant trends that are relatively negative related to congregational life. Over time, the percent of congregations that were declining by 5% or more in attendance, the blue bars, as you can see over time, more and more congregations were in that category. And fewer congregations were in the yellow bar category, which was growing by 5% or more. So what we saw up to 2023 was not a pretty picture. And then the 2025 data came along, which is from about 7,250 congregations, somewhere in that neighborhood. And weighted and is representative of the country as a whole. So quite a break from the pattern that was established over a couple of decades. But there are still some real lingering challenges for congregational life. And one of those is the aging of congregations, and for that matter, the aging of religious leaders. At no point in time, including the most recent survey, has the percentages of the ages of members really ever come close to matching what it is in the general public. Congregations are still significantly more representative of people over the age of 65, and underrepresentation of young adults. Pretty serious underrepresentation. The other significant challenge that's facing congregations and religious leaders and denominational leadership is the mismatch of size and where people are. The vast majority of people who attend congregations attend basically the top 10% of congregations in the country, right? So if the congregation is over 250, they're in the top 10% of congregations in the U.S. And they almost have 80% of all the people who attend, which means there's a massive number of small congregations with almost no one in them, relatively speaking. That's a real challenge for people distributing resources, writing literature. Do you write for most of the congregations, or do you write for where most of the people are? And most of the people who are in larger congregations, well-resourced, have all kinds of programs, if they go to move somewhere else and go to a smaller congregation, they're not going to find those kinds of things. So then they gravitate more toward larger congregations. And in fact, the pandemic has made this even a more significant challenge and problem. We've found since 2020, and so just in 5 years, that the percentage of people who are in the top 10% has gotten greater just in 5 years across our 6 or 7 surveys. And part of that is because, as I mentioned before, the larger the congregation, the more likely it is to be growing over the last 5 years. And so a congregation with 50 to 100, where the median is for the Seventh-day Adventists, maybe 30, 40% of those are growing. When you get over 500 and really over 1,500, you're talking about 55 to 65% of them are growing, and fewer of them are in decline. So not only do you have a disparity to begin with, but the resource-rich larger congregations are also drawing more people to them. And so then the gap keeps getting larger and larger. And this is probably, for me, one of the most worrisome things, because those very large congregations not only tend to be a distinctive kind of evangelical, but they also draw most attention from reporters, from the general public. And so then they shape what Christianity and religious life in the US supposedly looks like, in a way that the countless tens of thousands of smaller congregations can't really break into and say, no, there are other ways of being a faithful person besides just what a very large megachurch might do. So this is from somebody who has studied megachurches for my whole career. It's not, I think, a healthy thing for the U.S. religious life. I want to shift now a little bit away from congregations and talk for a few minutes about our attender data, because it also brings up a couple of interesting dynamics. You can see some of the demographics from the 25,000 that we looked at. We didn't really try to control this because it's almost impossible to know what the national profile of people who attend regularly to congregations is. It doesn't match quite what Pew's data shows, because people lie. And we happened to be surveying people who were sitting in congregations, so we knew they weren't lying about coming. And in fact, we got mostly the folks who were very committed to congregational life. Median age is 52, 2/3 of them are married, 10% of them were immigrants, 27% were children of immigrants, good many were Southern, and not surprisingly, 87% said faith is very important. One of the interesting things that we found that was a little surprising, actually, is that if we asked them how long they had been at the congregation, almost 40% had come to that congregation in the last 5 years. So in the period of the pandemic, there was a pretty significant influx of people into congregations. there were also people leaving the congregation, but we were fascinated by that and wanted to look more closely at that. So we looked at specifically the 38% who had come in the last 5 years, and where had they come from, and what kind of characteristics did they have. It turns out that almost 70% of them came from some other congregation. So there was a lot of shuffling, a lot of switching. And if you recall back, even in newspaper articles, but certainly in our experiences, that first year or so of the pandemic, a lot of people were disgruntled that their congregation had closed or about masking policies, and they switched to a different. And so there was some sorting out that happened in that early period. And in fact, that's what our data shows as well. So of that almost 40%, most of them came from some other congregation. That we used to call it sheep stealing, right? Shifting around. Circulation of the saints, also known as. But 22% of that 40% said that they hadn't gone to a congregation for a very long time. They used to, but then they left, and they were coming back. And 8% said they had never been in a congregation. Now, whether they were new converts or not, we don't know, but they were certainly converts to congregational life. Each of these three groups looks very, very different from the other. One thing that doesn't look very different is we asked them, what was your major influential factor in bringing you to this congregation? And which one was very important? And the one that was most important for all these folks by a long way, almost 2/3 of them said that what really drew them there was that it aligns with my beliefs, my values, and my preferences. A very kind of individualistic approach to what appealed to them about that congregation. Does it fit with what I believe? That's a little worrisome to me, actually. Following that is a welcoming atmosphere, the worship experience, and denomination or faith ties. Those are all kind of equal. And then things that I always thought were more important, things like family and friends are here, location, the reputation of the church or the pastor, the pastor's preaching. A lot of those qualities are what often gets presented as these are the things that you should be doing to draw new people in. But apparently that isn't what drew these folks in. As I said, very significant differences. The newer people that came were much younger. They had been less likely to attend, and they were more likely to be online. In terms of sort of what drew them and the differences, the congregational converts, that 8%, they were more likely to be young and to be men, to be single, to be immigrants, and to be non-white. The returners were a kind of mix in terms of demographics, but they talked a lot about wanting meaning and purpose and belonging and volunteering. They felt disconnected, right? So they were coming back to look for a community in many ways. And then the switchers switched relatively early in the pandemic. And they were most likely to look like the congregation that they became part of. They were more likely to be married, older, have kids, and as I said, change churches early in the pandemic. We were also able to ask if folks attended online, and if they did, were they exclusively online, or was it a mix of things? And this was This was also quite interesting, that hardly any of the attenders that we surveyed exclusively or primarily interacted with the congregation through virtual church or online. It was really a very small 7%. However, there was a large percent, 19%, that said they do a mix of online and in person. And that group was in many ways really the most interesting. By far, people preference in-person worship. Part of the reason why we don't count online attendance in our totals often. But the mix, because we asked these questions and then went a little bit deeper on kind of what experiences does a person have doing online worship, we also focused on those that it was 26% that say they do some online, to see like what goes on behind the screen, because a congregation doesn't really know how people are interacting with them through the virtual church. And lo and behold, almost 2/3 of them said when they're attending virtual church online, they're doing other things as well, right? They're not just sitting there riveted to the screen. Okay, that makes sense, sort of. And it causes us to wonder how many people sitting in the pews are also not really doing it, right? I mean, we all carry our other world here, right? So I may be putting in an order to pick up at Costco while I'm also, sitting in the pew. That's right, exactly. We all know that. That's good. Or texting somebody up. Right. As a kid, I used to pass notes to all my friends in the middle of the service. How is texting any different than that, right? So it may cause us to have to rethink, what is everyone riveted to my talk here, or are people like doing their email here? But with that 2/3 actively doing other things while also what, they're also extremely participatory, at least they say they are, and engaged in what's happening on the screen. 95% of them say they're also praying and meditating along with what's happening on the screen. They're reading along, they're singing along, and in some cases, they're actually even volunteering and participating in the service by doing readings or leading prayers, things like that. So just because they're distracted and doing some other stuff, taking care of the kids, cooking breakfast, whatever, it doesn't mean that they're completely disconnected. We also found that, especially for the folks that are in the hybrid model, a lot of that is due to convenience. They are working, they're traveling, other sorts of things, and having the online reality allows them to participate actually more than if it wasn't there. About half the people watch by themselves, participate by themselves online, and the other half with someone. The dual format, the having both online and in person, are much more likely to be families with children, to be younger, to be more diverse, and a little less committed than most people in the congregation. Those people that are primarily or exclusively online tend to be older, homebound, and much higher on a commitment mechanism. They give more money, they are more regularly participating, all of those kinds of things. But by and large, all the people who attend online are satisfied or very satisfied with their experiences, even though, from my perspective, some of those are not the greatest experiences. Uh, Another thing we uncovered from this attender survey was sort of an assumption of mine. I had done a survey of megachurches a long time ago and found that a lot of those folks participated in other congregations as well as the megachurch. And I wanted to see, given now that so many congregations were online, were other people in regular sized congregations doing some of this too? And what we found really surprised me. 46% of these hardcore attenders that we surveyed actually said that they regularly participate in any given month in other congregations, either in person or virtually. And the in-person, physically in-person attenders, 22% of those are going to multiple congregations, and another 10%, or excuse me, another 14% are doing physically and also virtually. So it's not that the virtual came up and now everybody shifted over to that. This was probably happening all the way along, but surveys never asked it. And so consequently, we didn't know it was happening, but in fact, it does. And we also asked if this was their church home, did they also have other church homes? Because the typical assumption is you ask, how long have you been coming here? And you assume that everybody's monogamous, right? But in fact, that's not the case. It wasn't the case in mega churches. It was 12% that said they had other church homes. And for this survey, it was 7% said that they have primary belonging in two different congregations. Turns out that the people who have multiple church homes, their commitment to the one they're in at the moment is lower, right? Can't serve two masters, right? They can't split up the tithe quite the same way, yeah. But those people who said that they attend other congregations within a month has no effect whatsoever on the commitment mechanisms like giving, attending, volunteering, any of those things. So two different dynamics are at work here. And the one that's really fascinating to me is this multiple attendance kind of commitments to other congregations. It's almost as if, for some people, one congregation's offerings are not enough. They're supplementing, they're adding to the experience at that one congregation, activities and events and other teachings and stuff at other congregations. And again, I don't think many of us in the religious world have thought about that, and how important that might be, right? If I'm doing a Bible study over here and I have a youth group that my kids go to over there, and this pastor has a weekly talk that I like, that's not a detriment. And in fact, when in the 1980s, a lot of my colleagues were studying televangelists, you found the same thing, that people that listened to televangelists, watched them, didn't diminish their commitment to their own congregation like people were worried about. It was an added bonus. It was an added effect to their spiritual life. Really quite fascinating stuff. So a few conclusions. I mean, congregations are absolutely stronger in 2025 than just a few years ago, and look better than they did pre-pandemic in so many ways. Not necessarily a story of revival, because there are still some detrimental things that are challenging congregational life. The pandemic has kind of reshuffled congregations, accelerated the sorting, the switching, and the consolidation into larger congregations. But it is a kind of more differentiated landscape than it was before. Some have found new energy, but about 45 to 50% are still struggling. And as you can see, there are very different dynamics of attender engagement and interaction. I would say after the pandemic, but in fact, we never asked the questions that we asked, so we don't know. But now we do know that those dynamics are in play. So it's a distinctive religious moment marked by a renewed sense of what's possible. And I think it's something for us to really ponder about the implications. We have all sorts of reports, as I said. They're all available on our website in PDF, but I also brought some paper copies if you like them. So thank you all. Oh, yeah.
It was not premeditated, but it's interesting. Yesterday we had this more qualitative approach, right? And today quantitative. Such a beautiful description and informed over the years and the scale about the congregational life in the United States. Wow, that's a privilege. We really appreciate that. And I'm glad we will have access to that presentation because I'm sure we will be drawing from this. Okay, few questions.
Yeah, two questions. I may have missed this, but what was your sample frame?
Yep.
I'm a sociologist too.
Yeah. Well, there's the sample sizes, but
how did you pick them?
yeah. So it's kind of a 2 or 3 part reality. One, a lot of the work that we've done in EPIC is on the backbone of our relationships with the Faith Communities Today partners. So those partners would randomly pick congregations from their denominations, and then we would put that together in an aggregate. But then we also draw a random sample from a couple of different church lists, and that pulls in another bunch of denominations that we don't have good relationships with.
It's broad.
Right. So we have that. Then we
large numbers covers the multiple.
right. Well, and then we put it all together. And then because of our research, we know like what percentages of congregations tend to be smaller, what regions they're in, and what's the denominational distribution across the country. So then we start to weight some of that data to try to make it more representative.
Another question I had, I'm from Andrews University, we're very congregation, and the vaccine split congregations.
Yeah.
The Adventist church are literally split church.
Yeah.
And didn't understand. Did you pick up any of that? And you talked about resorting.
Yeah.
The vaccine policy of the congregation impact.
We did ask a question. I didn't cover it in this presentation. Some of it is in the report. Not many congregations closed because of it. I mean, most congregations closed for a brief period of time. On average, I think it was 5 months disrupted. But we've also found that the longer it was disrupted, the more challenge you had. And we have encountered congregations that are still not back to their normal. And there's no for that might be in some ways as well. But we did ask a question. We asked several questions about the tensions around some specific policies related to COVID, but also there were many other things happening at the same time, racial reckonings and stuff. And so we asked some questions about that as well. And it's pretty clear that congregations that didn't embrace the policies of the CDC and such actually grew during the pandemic. Yeah, so if you're in public health and all, I'm sorry, it's really, I mean, it's sad, but it was true in many evangelical spaces. It was also true in the Orthodox and Catholic. If you bucked what was being said for public health, Yeah, significantly. Yeah.
We had a higher death.
Yeah, I don't know, but overall they still had a net positive of about, I think, 12 to 15% growth in that 5-year period.